There is a question that runs through almost every serious post-war account of the German experience on the Western Front. Which Allied force did German commanders ultimately fear the most? Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded all German forces in the West for much of the war, was captured by American troops on May 1st, 1945, and later interviewed extensively by British military historian Basil Liddell Hart. When pressed on what had defeated Germany in the West, his accounts returned repeatedly to the same themes: the crushing weight of American air power, the inexhaustible supply lines, the speed of American armored columns, and the devastating precision of American artillery. He spoke admiringly of Patton's breakout through France, and the picture that emerges from his collected post-war accounts, taken as a whole, strongly suggests that the transformed American military machine of 1944 and 1945 concerned him in ways that British and Canadian forces, however, determined and capable, did not to the same degree. Rundstedt never reduced this to a single clean ranking, but reading the evidence as historians have, it seems fair to say that he viewed the American system as something qualitatively different from any army he had faced in two world wars. That view becomes all the more remarkable when you consider where the American military story in World War II actually began. Not in glory, but in humiliation. In sand and smoke and chaos in the Tunisian mountains, where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and where Erwin Rommel wrote to his wife with something approaching satisfaction that the Americans had not yet learned how to fight. The distance between those two assessments, between Rommel's contempt in February 1943 and Rundstedt's grudging respect 2 years later, is one of the most extraordinary military transformations in recorded history. Understanding that journey and understanding why the Germans came to feel so differently about the Americans than they did about the British, the Canadians, or any other Allied force they faced requires going back to the very beginning, to the assumptions that shaped German thinking long before the first American soldier ever set foot in Tunisia. A nation dismissed before the fight began. When German military intelligence compiled its assessments of American fighting capacity in the years before the United States entered the war, the conclusions were not merely skeptical, they were dismissive to the point of contempt. In 1939, the United States Army ranked 19th in the world by size, smaller than the armies of Portugal and Romania. American factories produced automobiles and refrigerators, not tanks and artillery pieces. The nation had not fought a major land war in Europe in over 2 decades. Its officer corps was small, its equipment outdated, and its strategic doctrine largely untested. The Nazi ideology that sat at the heart of German military thinking made this contempt feel almost scientific. Adolf Hitler had convinced himself and much of his high command that national strength flowed from what he called racial purity and cultural homogeneity. Germany, in his worldview, possessed an inherent fighting spirit that came from its heritage. America, by contrast, was what his inner circle called a mongrel nation, a place of immigrants from dozens of countries, speaking different languages, practicing different faiths, with no shared identity deep enough to forge real soldiers from. Hitler told those around him that he did not see much future for the Americans, and that everything about their society revealed fundamental weaknesses. How could such a place produce warriors capable of withstanding the terrible pressure of modern industrial war? These conclusions were reinforced by the memory of the First World War. American troops had arrived in France in 1917 in the war's final phase and had performed adequately in the closing campaigns. But German officers who had faced those green soldiers in the Meuse-Argonne remembered them as enthusiastic but poorly disciplined, willing to attack with spirit, but tactically naive and unable to sustain complex combined arms operations. The idea that a new generation of Americans would prove fundamentally different seemed implausible to men who had spent their careers studying the art of war under far more demanding conditions. What the German military did not account for, what it structurally could not account for, was what an enormous industrial democracy looks like when it commits fully to a war it was forced into and has every reason to win. The United States in 1941 was not the United States of 1917. Its industrial base was the most powerful on Earth. Its population of over 130 million drew from every immigrant tradition in Europe, bringing languages, skills, and cultural perspectives that would prove assets rather than liabilities in the integrated warfare of the 1940s. A farm boy from Iowa who could fix a tractor could learn to service artillery. A factory worker from Detroit who understood production lines could grasp logistics in ways that soldiers from more stratified societies could not. But none of that was visible yet. The Germans would only discover what it meant when the fighting actually started. And the fighting started very badly indeed. Kasserine Pass. When every German assumption looked true. In November 1942, American troops came ashore in North Africa as part of Operation Torch. Their opponents were Vichy French soldiers of questionable motivation, and the landings were largely successful. The men who waded onto those beaches were young, confident, well-supplied, and utterly inexperienced. They had trained, yes. Many of them had trained for months in England and the American South, but training and combat are separated by a gulf that only the fighting itself can bridge. The man put in charge of the American Second Corps in Tunisia was Major General Lloyd Fredendall, and his tenure in command would become one of the most studied examples of military failure in American history. He dispersed his forces across a front of roughly 30 miles, leaving individual units isolated and unable to support one another when the pressure came. He established his personal headquarters in an elaborate bunker carved into a mountainside some 70 miles behind the front lines. So far from the battle, he was supposed to direct that his own troops began to mock him openly. His orders were confused and contradictory. His communications failed at critical moments, and in one particularly damning detail, he had diverted combat engineers away from building defensive positions and set them to excavating his personal command post instead, a choice that spoke volumes about his priorities. On February 14, 1943, Rommel struck. The Africa Corps rolled through gaps in the American line that should never have existed, advancing. With the casual confidence of men who had spent 2 years fighting across North Africa and had learned to read terrain and opportunity with an almost instinctive fluency. American tanks, caught in the open without adequate infantry or artillery support, burned under the fire of German 88mm guns that had been turning Allied armor into wreckage since the earliest days of the Desert Campaign. Infantry units broke and scattered without orders, abandoning equipment worth millions of dollars in the desert sand. Units that should have been able to support each other fought in isolation and were destroyed in detail by concentrated German forces. The retreat became a rout. Panic spread through rear areas that had never expected to see combat. Officers lost contact with their men in the confusion. American forces suffered approximately 6,500 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, out of around 30,000 engaged. Hundreds of prisoners marched into German captivity. The numbers told part of the story. The nature of the collapse told the rest of it. Omar Bradley, who would later command the largest American army in history during the liberation of France, later described Kasserine as probably the worst performance by United States Army troops in their whole proud history. Rommel was more measured in his private writing. He acknowledged that the Americans had reorganized more quickly than he expected toward the end, and Wikipedia notes he later praised American equipment, calling the M3 half-track particularly sturdy. But his fundamental conclusion was clear enough. These were soldiers who had not yet learned to fight. What neither Rommel nor any other German commander understood in that moment was something critical about what they had actually witnessed. They had not seen the American army at its normal level of competence. They had seen an American army in the very first painful weeks of its education, commanded by an incompetent general, composed largely of soldiers who had never been shot at before, facing an enemy that had been fighting for years. They had confused a starting point with a ceiling, and that confusion would cost them dearly in the months and years that followed. Patton arrives and everything changes. Within weeks of Kasserine, Dwight Eisenhower had seen enough of Fredendall. He was relieved and replaced by someone who operated at an entirely different frequency, George Smith Patton, who descended on the demoralized Second Corps like a force of nature. If Fredendall had been a symbol of everything wrong with American military leadership in its early phase, Patton became a symbol of something almost the opposite, an absolute uncompromising demand for excellence that bordered on the theatrical but produced genuine results. He started with appearance and discipline because he understood something counterintuitive, that the small things matter enormously in shaping what soldiers believe about themselves. Men who wore their helmets and neckties at all times, who stood at attention and kept their weapons clean, were men who were treating themselves like soldiers. Men who slouched through their days in dirty uniforms were giving themselves permission to be less. Patton personally fined officers who appeared without proper uniform. He threatened court-martial for cowardice. He was profane, he was intense, and he was everywhere at once, a visible and exhausting presence that made it impossible for anyone to pretend that things were fine when they were not. But the transformation he oversaw was not merely about discipline. It was about doctrine, coordination, and the integration of different arms in ways that the disaster at Kasserine had shown were entirely absent. Air-ground coordination, which had been nearly non-existent when Rommel struck, was rebuilt from scratch under new procedures developed by Brigadier General Lawrence Kuter. Artillery control, which would become the most feared element of the American military system, was tightened and centralized in ways that gave observers the ability to call down fire from multiple batteries within minutes rather than hours. The lessons of Kasserine were absorbed, documented, and acted upon with a speed that astonished everyone who watched the process. Just 6 weeks after the disaster, the Americans had their first chance to prove whether the transformation was real. El Guitar, the first sign that something had changed. On March 23, 1943, at the narrow defile of El Guetar in southern Tunisia, the 1st Infantry Division took up defensive positions across the approaches to a vital pass and waited. At 6 o'clock that morning, 50 tanks of the 10th Panzer Division, one of the finest armored formations in North Africa, rolled toward them with the casual confidence that had served German forces so well at Kasserine. The panzer crews expected to scatter the Americans, as they had done 6 weeks earlier. Their mechanics were efficient, their gunnery was excellent, and their experience was deep. They had beaten these same people before. They saw no reason to expect a different result. What happened instead was a systematic demolition of the German attack. American mines stopped the lead panzers cold, channeling the following vehicles into killing zones. M3 tank destroyers from the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion opened fire from concealed positions with accuracy that caught the German crews off guard. Infantry held their ground with a steadiness that had been conspicuously absent at Kasserine, firing with control, maintaining unit cohesion under pressure, refusing to be moved by the shock of armored attack. When the German attack lost momentum in the minefield, American artillery and anti-tank guns opened up on the stalled column. 30 German tanks were left burning or disabled on the approaches to the pass by mid-morning. The Germans attempted a second attack at 4:45 that afternoon. American artillery once again broke it apart. By nightfall, what remained of the attacking force had retreated toward German headquarters at Gabes. But the most significant thing that happened at El Guitar was not visible to the naked eye on the battlefield. It happened in the coordination of American artillery. What the 10th Panzer Division encountered was not the scattered fire of individual batteries working independently. It was a concentrated, massed barrage from multiple units, coordinated through a centralized system, falling on German tanks and infantry with a precision and density that the veterans of the Afrika Korps found deeply unsettling. Based on the pattern of what followed, the way German commanders consistently returned to American artillery as their chief fear in interrogation after interrogation, it seems reasonable to infer that El Guitar was many German soldiers' first real encounter with the American fire direction system at its most effective. Something had changed. The question was whether it would hold. Rommel himself, reading the reports that came back to him, he had left Africa for medical treatment just 2 weeks earlier and was following the battle from Germany, was beginning to understand that he had fundamentally misjudged what he was dealing with. He still believed, correctly, that American soldiers lacked the deep combat experience of his veteran formations. But the army that had fought at El Guitar was not the army he had routed at Kasserine, and the pace of the change alarmed him in ways that none of his earlier campaigns had prepared him for. By May 1943, the Tunisian campaign was over. Roughly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered to Allied forces, approximately 3 times the number the Soviets had taken at Stalingrad 4 months earlier. The men who had panicked under Rommel's first assault were now among the victors, processing captured equipment and accepting German surrenders. In his papers, published after the war, Rommel would write with unusual candor about his former opponents in that final North African campaign, noting that the Americans had paid a stiff price for their experience, but that it had brought rich dividends, and that he had needed to wait for Patton's army in France to see the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare. The secret weapon, American artillery. To understand why German soldiers came to fear the American military as deeply as they did, you have to understand something that gets far less attention than tanks and air power in the popular history of the war. You have to understand the American artillery system, because German veterans and officers who survived to tell the story consistently identified it as the single weapon they feared above all others. Above tanks, above fighter bombers, above anything else on the Western Front. The system that produced this fear was not built during the war. It was developed quietly and methodically between the wars at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, during the years when most nations were cutting military budgets and paying little attention to artillery innovation. What emerged from those quiet years was something genuinely unique, a centralized fire direction system that allowed any observer anywhere on the battlefield to call for fire from any battery in range without needing a prior relationship or a dedicated communications link to that specific unit. In practical terms, this meant that fire requests could be passed upward through the chain from battalion to division to corps, concentrating the guns of an entire army on a single, critical target if the situation demanded it. The mathematics of fire control were simplified through mechanical aids and standardized procedures that had been carefully refined during those interwar years. American artillery could put shells on a target in approximately 3 minutes from the moment a forward observer called in the request. German artillery systems required 10 to 12 minutes to achieve the same result and often could not mass fire from multiple units with the same efficiency even when that time was available. 3 minutes versus 12 minutes. On a battlefield where a retreating column can cover significant ground in the time between a call and the first shell landing, that difference was not merely tactical. It was existential. The technique that German soldiers came to dread above all others was called time on target. Batteries of different calibers positioned at different distances from a target would calculate their firing times with precise coordination so that every shell from every participating gun arrived simultaneously, within a window of just a few seconds. For the German soldiers in the impact zone, the effect was almost impossible to describe to someone who had not experienced it. The silence would shatter into instantaneous, overwhelming destruction, appearing from nowhere. There was no warning shot, no adjustment, just sudden total devastation appearing all at once from the sky, as if the air itself had simply decided to kill everyone below. The Americans perfected another element of their artillery system that multiplied its reach dramatically: the observation aircraft. A fragile, unarmed Piper Cub flying circles over the battlefield, barely faster than a car, could direct the fire of dozens of guns on any target visible from the air. German soldiers learned to dread the sight of these tiny liaison planes orbiting overhead. They knew exactly what followed. Within minutes, shells would begin falling with an accuracy that seemed preternatural to men accustomed to the slower, more cumbersome fire coordination of other armies. The observer would walk the fire across German positions with methodical precision until the target was destroyed. Then came the proximity fuse, and with it, a new dimension of terror. The proximity fuse was one of the most ambitious weapons programs of the entire war, second only to the atomic bomb in the investment it required. The Americans spent over $1 billion developing and producing a miniature radar set small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, a device that would sense the ground as the shell descended and detonate at the optimal height for maximum fragmentation, typically around 30 feet above the surface. Before its introduction, soldiers in foxholes and trenches had reasonable protection from artillery fire. A shell buried in soft ground before exploding lost most of its energy to dirt. A properly dug fighting position offered real shelter against even heavy bombardment. The proximity fuse changed all of that. Shells that would previously have been absorbed by the earth now burst in the air and showered shrapnel downward onto soldiers in their holes, onto troops sheltering in ditches and under trees, onto any position that offered cover from direct fire, but not from fragments falling from above. The effect was 5 to 10 times more lethal than conventional artillery fire against dug-in infantry. American prisoners of war taken during the Battle of the Bulge, when the fuse was first used in large numbers against ground troops, reported something remarkable. Some German soldiers had charged directly into American positions rather than endure the airburst artillery. They preferred the risk of being shot in a direct assault to the certainty of being torn apart by fragments while cowering in their foxholes. The VT fuse, as it was known in coded nomenclature, had crossed the line from being a tactical tool into being a source of psychological horror. General Patton, never a man to understate his own satisfaction, wrote to the War Department about the new weapon in terms that were characteristically direct. He reported that his forces had caught a German battalion crossing the Sour River with a battalion concentration using the new shell and killed by actual Count 702 enemy soldiers. He added that he believed when all armies got the shell, they would need to devise some entirely new method of warfare. Beyond the technology, the sheer volume of American ammunition production was something German commanders genuinely struggled to process. Battery C of the 337th Field Artillery Battalion fired its 300,000th round between June 1944 and March 1945, an output that would have exhausted the entire ammunition stocks of a German corps. For the Rhine crossing in March 1945, 2,700 American guns opened fire at a rate exceeding 1,000 rounds per minute, putting more than 65,000 shells into a single bombardment that lasted just over an hour. German artillery, forced to conserve every round and operating with a logistical nightmare of captured guns from across occupied Europe, French, Czech, Polish, Soviet, that each required different caliber ammunition and different maintenance procedures, could not begin to match this volume or this standardization. This was, in Eois Andarim miniature, the broader story of what made the Americans so formidable. Individual skill and training mattered, but the system that multiplied individual performance, the supply chain that never ran dry, the command culture that learned from failure rather than denying it, the industrial standardization that meant a shell made in Ohio would fit a gun assembled in Michigan and be loaded by a crew trained in Oklahoma. That was what German commanders ultimately feared most. Normandy. Improvisation against the bocage. When Allied forces came ashore at Normandy on June 6, 1944, the American soldiers who advanced inland from Utah and Omaha beaches encountered a landscape that no amount of planning had adequately prepared them for. The bocage, the ancient hedgerow country of Normandy, was unlike any terrain most of them had trained in. These were not hedges in any sense an American from Kansas or Georgia would recognize. They were ancient earthen banks, some as much as 15 feet, high and 12 feet thick, topped with dense vegetation that had been accumulating for centuries. Each field was enclosed by these natural fortresses, with the road between them often sunk several feet below the surrounding ground level. A typical square mile of Normandy countryside might contain hundreds of these irregular enclosures, each one offering perfect defensive positions to a handful of German soldiers with machine guns and anti-tank weapons. The tactical problem they created was almost perfectly designed to neutralize American advantages. A tank that tried to climb over a hedgerow exposed its thin belly armor to anti-tank fire from any defender on the other side. A tank that tried to drive through a gap in the hedge drove directly into the killing zone of weapons, positioned specifically to cover exactly those gaps. Infantry advancing without tank support was cut down by machine gun crossfire from positions that were nearly impossible to suppress without direct observation. And artillery, however excellent, could not reliably target defenders who were dug into the base of the earthen banks themselves, invisible from aircraft, and protected by several feet of densely packed soil. For weeks after D-Day, the Normandy campaign ground to a bloody stalemate in the bocage. The gains were measured in yards rather than miles. The casualties mounted in ways that threatened to exhaust some divisions before the campaign could break into open country. German commanders who observed the American struggles during those difficult weeks allowed themselves a cautious optimism. Perhaps this was Kasserine repeating itself in a different setting. Perhaps the Americans, for all their material abundance, could not solve a tactical problem that required genuine improvisation rather than firepower alone. Those commanders did not understand what American military culture looked like at its most characteristic. Across the American sector, units began developing solutions to the hedgerow problem without waiting for orders from above. Tank crews experimented independently with modifications to their vehicles. Infantry squads adapted their attack sequences field by field, sharing discoveries through informal networks that cut across official channels. Engineers tried explosive charges, mechanical devices, and hybrid approaches, looking for anything that would work. The solutions spread laterally from unit to unit at a speed that formal military communication structures could not have achieved. Because the American military had built a culture that tolerated and actively encouraged this kind of grassroots innovation. The most famous solution came from Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Inspired by a suggestion from another soldier, Cullen designed a set of steel prongs, fabricated from the German beach obstacles that Rommel had ordered placed along the Normandy coast, and welded them to the front hull of a Sherman tank. The device worked by driving into the earthen bank at ground level rather than climbing over it, allowing the tank to push through while keeping its gun trained forward and its belly armor protected. When General Omar Bradley saw a demonstration, he immediately grasped its significance and ordered mass production through ordnance units that worked around the clock to manufacture the cutters from the abundant supply of captured German steel on the beaches. By the time Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944, roughly 60% of all American medium tanks in the First Army carried some variant of the hedgerow cutter. And critically, the device had been kept strictly secret from German intelligence to maximize the shock of its first appearance in combat. It was perhaps the perfect symbol of what separated the American approach to war from the German one by this stage of the conflict. The Germans had built fixed, elaborate coastal defenses out of steel obstacles. The Americans had picked up that same steel and turned it into a weapon to destroy those defenses. The raw material of German strategy had become the tool of American offense. Operation Cobra and the destruction of Panzer Lehr. The plan for Operation Cobra was breathtaking in its ambition and its violence. Omar Bradley flew to England personally to request what he called the biggest thing in the world: a massive aerial bombardment on a rectangle of bocage country west of St. Lo, dense enough to obliterate every defensive position in the target zone and leave German survivors too stunned to organize coherent resistance before American ground forces could pour through the gap. On July 25, 1944, approximately 1,500 heavy bombers dropped over 3,000 tons of explosives onto a corridor roughly 3.5 miles long and 1.5 miles deep. Panzer Lehr, one of the finest armored divisions in the entire German military. A formation built around experienced cadres and first-rate equipment, stationed directly in the center of the impact zone, ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force in the space of a single morning. When the day's survivors came out of their shattered positions to face the American ground assault, they found that they no longer had a division. They had the scattered remnants of one, unable to communicate, unable to coordinate, led by officers who were themselves in various states of shock. Against them came American infantry divisions supported by armor, equipped with the newly secret hedgerow cutters, rolling through the bocage with a mobility that the Germans had believed was impossible just days before. The division commander, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, would later describe what happened in terms that became some of the most quoted words in the literature of the Second World War. Writing in his memoirs, he described the bombers coming as if on a conveyor belt, back and forth, laying their carpets of destruction. Artillery positions were wiped out, tanks overturned and buried, infantry positions flattened, and all roads destroyed. By midday, he wrote, the entire area resembled a Mondlandschaft, a moonscape, with bomb craters touching rim to rim. All signal communications had been cut, and no command was possible. The shock effect on the troops, he said, was indescribable. Several of his men went mad and rushed round in the open until they were cut down by splinters. His final estimate was that over 70% of his soldiers were either dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed. Panzerlehr, which had entered the bombardment as one of Germany's finest divisions, had been gutted in a single morning. Patton's Third Army poured through the breach at Avranches and swept across France in an offensive that covered more ground in less time than any comparable armored operation in the history of warfare up to that point. German commanders watched in disbelief and mounting horror as American armored columns appeared behind their defensive positions, cutting communications, overrunning supply depots, surrounding entire formations before they could organize orderly retreats. The encirclement at the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, which was the result of this momentum, trapped roughly 100,000 German soldiers. The core of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, in a shrinking perimeter under continuous attack from the ground and relentless assault from the air. The scenes inside and around the Falaise Pocket after its final closure in late August were among the most horrific of the entire war. Eisenhower walked the battlefield and wrote that he had seen scenes describable only by Dante, that it was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh, on horses and men and machines jumbled together in a landscape of absolute destruction. Roughly 10,000 German soldiers died inside the pocket. Another 50,000 surrendered when further resistance became impossible. The veteran German formations that had seemed so formidable in those early Tunisia days. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Panzerlehr, the 2nd Panzer, had been gutted. Germany had no strategic reserve in France capable of reconstituting a coherent defense. Heinz Guderian, the man who had theorized and implemented the blitzkrieg that had conquered France in 1940, was asked after the war about Patton's performance in France. He acknowledged in plain terms that he heard much about Patton and that he conducted a good campaign. From the standpoint of a tank specialist, he said, he had to congratulate him on his victory, since he had acted as Guderian himself would have done had he been in Patton's place facing similar circumstances. Coming from the acknowledged master of mechanized warfare, this was extraordinary professional praise. Alfred Jodl, chief of operations at German Supreme Headquarters throughout the war, was even blunter about the strategic verdict. The war was already lost in the West, he said during his captivity. At the time of the breakthrough and the beginning of the war of movement in France, the German army that had been so confident facing Americans at Kasserine had been broken beyond hope of recovery. The Battle of the Bulge. One last test. Hitler refused to accept the verdict of Normandy. In December 1944, he assembled the last strategic reserves of the German military. carefully rebuilt SS Panzer divisions, fresh ammunition stocks hoarded for months, elite formations given priority of supply, and launched them against the weakest sector of the Allied line in the Ardennes forest. The offensive was premised in part on an assumption that German intelligence had failed to update, that American soldiers would crumble under determined surprise assault, as they had at Kasserine nearly 2 years before. Hitler still believed, or chose to believe, that the Americans were fundamentally soft, incapable of withstanding the shock of sudden attack by veteran formations in the way that German soldiers could withstand it. The offensive began on December 16, 1944, and achieved complete tactical surprise. German forces attacked through fog and snow that grounded Allied aircraft and stripped away the air superiority that had made daylight movement suicidal for German forces throughout the Normandy campaign. Initial assaults shattered thinly held American positions along a 50-mile front and sent shockwaves all the way back to Eisenhower's headquarters. And then the American army showed Hitler exactly how wrong he was. At Lanzerath Ridge, 18 soldiers from Lieutenant Lyle Buch's intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, along with 4 forward artillery observers, 22 Americans in total, held their isolated position against approximately 500 German paratroopers from the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division for nearly 20 hours. These were not ordinary defenders facing ordinary troops. The German paratroopers were among the finest infantry Germany still had available, and 22 Americans held them. The delay disrupted the carefully planned German timetable at a moment when minutes and hours mattered enormously, buying time for American reinforcements to reach threatened sectors before the assault could achieve the speed it needed to succeed. When it was over, only 1 American had been killed. 14 others were wounded. German casualties totaled at least 92. The platoon was finally flanked and captured at dusk, yet the German paratroopers who searched the woods afterward were stunned to discover that the entire force holding them for a full day had been fewer than 24 men. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions established positions that blocked the entire 6th SS Panzer Army. The main effort of the German offensive, containing some of the finest remaining formations in the Wehrmacht. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend, composed of fanatical young soldiers who had been indoctrinated since childhood and who had performed with terrifying effectiveness in Normandy, was decimated in repeated attacks against American positions. Their tanks burned where they stopped. Their infantry died in the snow. The offensive that was supposed to reach Antwerp and split the Allied armies in two collapsed within sight of its first-day objectives. At Bastogne, a situation developed that became the defining image of American resilience in the entire European war. The 101st Airborne Division, reinforced by elements of the 10th Armored Division and various other scattered units, found itself completely surrounded by overwhelming German forces. The German commander sent a formal ultimatum demanding surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the 101st in the absence of his division commander, responded with a single word that his staff then formalized into proper military correspondence: nuts. The word became legendary. The defense it expressed became legendary too. The 101st and its attached units held their shrinking perimeter through days of bitter fighting in freezing conditions with dwindling supplies, until Patton accomplished what is still regarded as one of the greatest logistical and tactical feats of the entire war, pivoting his entire Third Army, more than 133,000 vehicles and troops, 90 degrees northward. When that movement began, Patton's lead tanks were still 150 miles south of Bastogne, grinding through winter slush and ice in some of the worst weather the region had seen in decades. He relieved the siege on December 26, 1944, when elements of the 4th Armored Division made contact with 101st Defenders just before dusk. Winston Churchill, who had seen every facet of Allied performance over 6 years of war, addressed the House of Commons in January 1945, and specifically told Parliament that care must be taken not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what was undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. The Battle of the Bulge consumed Germany's last strategic reserves of men and equipment in the West. What began as Hitler's attempt to repeat the shock of Kasserine ended as the final proof that there was no shock capable of breaking the American military system that had been built since those dark days in Tunisia. Why not the British? Understanding the contrast. The contrast between German assessments of American forces and German assessments of British forces illuminates something important about what made the Americans distinctively feared rather than merely respected. And to understand that contrast, you have to be careful to understand it honestly, because the German version of the story has its own self-serving elements that need to be acknowledged. German officers consistently described the British with professional respect, and they meant it. The British were competent, methodical, tenacious, and professionally skilled. They were capable of mounting powerful, coordinated offensives with impressive logistical support. Their soldiers were brave and their officers were generally able. What they were, from the German perspective, was predictable. Montgomery's operations in Normandy and afterward followed patterns that German intelligence could read days in advance. The logistical buildup that preceded any British offensive was visible through aerial reconnaissance. The preliminary bombardment that followed provided hours of warning that the assault was coming. Then the infantry and armor advanced according to set-piece doctrine that had been refined in the desert campaigns. German commanders felt they understood how British offensives would unfold, which meant they could prepare their defenses accordingly. Rundstedt admitted in his post-war debriefings that he had strongly favored concentrating mobile reserves inland rather than committing them piecemeal against the beachhead. What his accounts suggest, and what the pattern of armored deployments in Normandy confirms, is that German armor ended up concentrated primarily against the British sector around Caen, with 6 of the 7 panzer divisions facing British and Canadian forces for much of the campaign. Whether this reflected a deliberate German choice to screen against the British while watching the Americans, or simply the tactical realities of where the fighting was heaviest, historians continue to debate. But the effect was clear. The British and Canadians absorbed the armored weight of Germany's remaining mobile reserves, while the Americans built the momentum that would produce the Cobra breakout. But this comparison requires some important context that German officers tended to omit when explaining their defeats. The British deliberately drew the heaviest German formations toward themselves in Normandy. Montgomery's operational plan specifically assigned British and Canadian forces the task of holding German armor around Caen while the Americans prepared the breakout further west. 6 of the 7 panzer divisions committed to the Normandy battle were concentrated against the British and Canadian sector, including Panzer Lehr and the fanatical 12th SS. British caution was partly a rational response to facing the strongest German opposition on ground that heavily favored armored defense. There was also a strategic human factor that German critics consistently ignored. Britain had been fighting continuously for 2 years longer than the Americans, with the devastating mass casualty memories of the Somme and Passchendaele still deeply embedded in national consciousness. Britain simply could not absorb casualties at the same rate as a nation with a larger population that had entered the war more recently. Conservative tactics that husbanded manpower were not timidity. They were strategic prudence and arguably strategic necessity. Churchill himself had made the political calculation that Britain could not survive another attritional bloodbath on the scale of the First World War. The Americans, newer to the fight, with fresh populations and an industrial output that could replace virtually any loss, could afford a more aggressive and improvisational approach. And they had developed a military culture that rewarded exactly this kind of thinking at every level. What made the Americans different? When German commanders tried to explain, in their post-war interrogations and memoirs, what had made the Americans so formidable once they reached maturity, they kept returning to the same themes. It was not individual fighting quality, though they respected individual American soldiers. It was not any single weapon, though. They feared American artillery above all others. It was the system, the integrated, adaptable, self-correcting machine that multiplied the effectiveness of every component beyond what the components could achieve individually. The artillery that could mass hundreds of guns on a single target within 3 minutes. The air power that made daylight movement suicidal for any German formation with enough vehicles to constitute a real military target. The logistics that kept ammunition and fuel and replacement equipment flowing in quantities that seemed bottomless, because they very nearly were. When American tanks were destroyed, more tanks arrived within days from depots that never seemed to empty. When ammunition was expended, more arrived within hours on trucks that kept coming regardless of losses. The flow never stopped, never even seemed to slow. The organizational culture that learned from every failure rather than covering it up or rationalizing it away. The willingness to relieve incompetent commanders quickly and without institutional embarrassment, as happened to Friedendahl, rather than allowing seniority and professional relationships to protect men who were getting soldiers killed. The tolerance for innovation at the lowest levels, where a sergeant with an idea could get it in front of a general within days if the idea was good enough, and where the general might order it produced in the thousands before the week was out. Perhaps most fundamentally, the Americans were fighting a war they understood in a way that connected their individual effort to a larger purpose. These were men from farms and cities and factories across a vast continent who had been told, and who largely believed, that the world depended on what they did next. That belief produced not invincibility, but something more useful in a long war: resilience. The capacity to absorb catastrophe and come back with improved judgment and undiminished determination. The Germans who faced them at Kasserine and Elsenborn Ridge and Bastogne were often the same men, or the sons and brothers of the same men who had spent years fighting across North Africa and Europe with extraordinary skill and bravery. But by 1944 and 1945, those men were fighting with dwindling ammunition on shrinking territory for a cause that was visibly lost, under a command structure that was frequently irrational and occasionally suicidal. The Americans were fighting from abundance, material abundance and moral abundance both. And in a long industrial war, abundance matters. Blumenritt, the German general who spoke to Basil Little Hart after the war and praised Patton as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action, was not being diplomatic. He was being accurate. The army he described had not existed at Kasserine. It had been built, battle by battle, in the unforgiving school of combat that began in the Tunisian mountains and ended in the ruins of the Third Reich. The distance between two moments. We began with Rommel watching Americans run in the Tunisian desert, writing to his wife that they had not yet learned how to fight. We end with German commanders in captivity, in honest reflection, acknowledging that the Americans had become something that frightened them in a way that no other opponent on the Western Front had managed. The distance between those two moments is not really about military doctrine or weapons technology or even individual bravery, though all of those things played their part. It is about what a free society looks like when it decides to win. It is about an institution that treated failure not as a shameful secret to be buried, but as information to be acted upon. It is about men who came from a country that had built itself through improvisation and practical problem solving, and who brought exactly those qualities to bear when the problems were life and death rather than engineering and commerce. The Germans who saw Kasserine were not wrong about what they saw. The soldiers who fled that day in February 1943 really were inexperienced, poorly led, and tactically naive. What the Germans got catastrophically wrong was their assumption about what those men could become and how quickly they could become it. They measured potential by a single moment of failure and concluded that the ceiling was low. The ceiling turned out to be Bastogne and Cobra and the Rhine crossing and the liberation of an entire continent. Those men went home when it was over. Most of them lived long lives and never spoke much about what they had done. They had not thought of themselves as doing anything extraordinary. They had simply done what was asked of them and improved as fast as they could and kept going when it was hard. In doing so, they gave the army that had conquered most of Europe, that had seemed invincible, a reason to be genuinely afraid. That seems worth remembering. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to leave a like. It helps us reach more people who care about this history, and it means the world to us. If you're new here and want to keep exploring, the stories of the Second World War told this way, slowly, honestly, and with the weight they deserve. Then subscribing would make you part of a community that believes this history matters. We're grateful for every one of you who makes this channel possible. Until next time.